October 23, 1974. In a sterile boardroom far from its Philadelphia roots, the Ford Motor Company quietly signed away the remains of Philco. There was no grand ceremony, no final tribute to the thousands of workers who had built their lives and families around its assembly lines. The brand was simply liquidated, sold off like corporate scrap metal to a rival electronics firm. Just a few decades earlier, this scrap was the undisputed king of the American living room. At its absolute peak, Philco didn't just manufacture radios, they defined an era. They commanded a staggering 30% of the entire national market, producing tens of millions of devices and employing tens of thousands of skilled workers. They built the iconic Cathedral radios, dominated the vacuum tube industry, and even engineered the vital radar systems that helped the Allies win World War II. They were a towering, untouchable industrial titan. But today, the massive red brick factories that once thundered with production are silent. The name Philco is little more than a ghost in the static, a hollow badge slapped onto cheap, outsourced appliances. How does an undisputed technological pioneer, a company that outsmarted RCA and later helped design the control center for NASA's Apollo space missions, completely evaporate? It wasn't just the arrival of the transistor, and it wasn't merely the flood of foreign competition. It was a fatal combination of reckless expansion, a tragic loss of identity, and a desperate, ill-fated marriage to a Detroit automaker. This is the story of Philco's spectacular rise, its devastating downfall, and the ultimate price of forgetting what made you great in the first place. Before the majestic wooden cabinets graced millions of American living rooms, before the golden age of broadcasting united a fractured nation, there was only the sharp, metallic tang of lead and sulfuric acid. The story of America's greatest radio empire does not begin with music or news, but with heavy industry. In 1892, a small group of ambitious men in Pennsylvania formed the Helios Electric Company. Their initial mission was straightforward: manufacture carbon arc lamps for the rapidly electrifying streets of the Northeast. But the market was brutally unforgiving. Thomas Edison's incandescent bulbs quickly proved superior, and by 1904, the Helios venture was effectively dead, suffocated by the relentless march of technological progress. However, from the ashes of that early failure emerged a more resilient enterprise. In 1906, the company reorganized as the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company. They abandoned municipal lighting and turned their attention to the grueling, unglamorous world of stored industrial power. For the next decade, their factories produced heavy-duty batteries for electric delivery trucks, underground mine locomotives, and the burgeoning automobile industry. In 1919, seeking a catchier brand identity for their growing automotive battery line, they introduced a simple portmanteau of their name, Philco. It was a modest, pragmatic business. The executives envisioned a stable future rooted in automotive components. They had no intention of becoming a household consumer brand, let alone an electronics giant. Then came the Roaring '20s, and with it, the first great American broadcasting boom. Suddenly, radio was the new magic. Families gathered in their parlors, staring in awe at wooden boxes that plucked voices and music seemingly out of thin air. But the reality of early radio ownership was far less magical than the concept. The technology of the early 1920s was primitive and heavily dependent on direct current DC power. To operate a radio, a household needed cumbersome, expensive, and dangerous power sources. These early sets required a heavy A battery to heat the vacuum tube filaments, and a series of B batteries to provide the higher voltage needed for the circuits. These were not the neat dry cells of today. They were massive liquid lead-acid batteries, identical to those used in automobiles. They leaked corrosive sulfuric acid onto expensive living room rugs. They emitted noxious fumes. Most frustratingly, they constantly lost their charge, requiring owners to lug the heavy, sloshing boxes down to local garages to be recharged, missing their favorite broadcasts in the process. The engineers at the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company recognized a massive, untapped vulnerability in this booming market. They realized that while everyone was focused on building the radio sets, the real bottleneck was the power supply. In 1925, Philco introduced a revolutionary product that would change the trajectory of the company forever: the socket power battery eliminator. The socket power unit was a stroke of pragmatic genius. It was a rectifier device that allowed consumers to plug their radios directly into a standard household wall socket. The unit took the alternating current, AC, from the city power grid and seamlessly converted it into the steady direct current, DC, that the radio tubes demanded, effectively replacing the messy, unreliable B batteries. The public response was explosive. Almost overnight, Philco transformed from a mid-tier industrial supplier into a consumer electronics necessity. By 1926, the company was manufacturing over 40,000 socket power units a week. Production lines in Philadelphia ran day and night. Revenues skyrocketed. Philco dominated the accessory market, boasting that their units were powering millions of radios across the continent. They had found their gold mine. The future seemed infinitely secure. But in the technology sector, security is an illusion. The very forces of innovation that had elevated Philco were about to turn against them with devastating speed. In 1927, the landscape of the entire industry violently shifted. The Radio Corporation of America, RCA, the undisputed titan of early broadcasting and electronics, introduced the revolutionary AC vacuum tube. This single invention bypassed the need for DC conversion altogether. New radios could now be designed to plug directly into the wall, drawing alternating current straight from the grid without any need for external rectifiers, socket power units, or acid batteries. In a matter of months, Philco's entire highly profitable product line was rendered completely obsolete. The demand for battery eliminators didn't just decline, it evaporated. Warehouses quickly filled with unsold inventory, factory floors that had recently thundered with the sounds of round-the-clock production fell ominously silent. The Philadelphia Storage Battery Company found itself staring into the abyss of bankruptcy for the second time in its history. The company's leadership faced an existential crisis. They had over 3,000 employees, massive manufacturing facilities, and a nationwide distribution network, but no product to sell. The board of directors convened in late 1927 with a grim agenda. The logical, conservative choice was to liquidate the remaining assets, pay off the creditors, and shut down the factories for good. Instead, they chose to gamble everything. If the market no longer needed batteries or power units for radios, then the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company would stop making accessories. They would leap directly into the fire. They decided to manufacture the radios themselves. It was a terrifying proposition. They were stepping into an arena dominated by entrenched giants like RCA, Atwater Kent, and Zenith. Companies with vast patents, deep pockets, and established consumer loyalty. Philco had no experience in acoustic design, no background in cabinet making, and no radio patents of their own. They were the underdogs, fighting for their very survival. But as the final days of 1927 ticked away, the die was cast. They would either conquer the living rooms of America, or they would vanish entirely. The year was 1928, and the sprawling brick complex of the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company was undergoing a violent, desperate metamorphosis. The heavy vats of sulfuric acid and the lead-smelting furnaces, the very lifeblood of the company for 2 decades, were systematically ripped out and hauled away. In their place came miles of canvas conveyor belts, rows of soldering stations, and forests of copper wire. The executives at Philco, men who had spent their entire professional lives calculating battery capacities and courting automotive executives, now suddenly found themselves debating the finer points of acoustic resonance and the aesthetic appeal of walnut veneers. It was a jarring, almost comical shift in corporate identity. Yet, in the brutal arena of American industry, desperation frequently breeds remarkable agility. Philco was stepping into a battlefield already dominated by entrenched titans. The Radio Corporation of America, RCA, held a stranglehold on vital patents and broadcasting networks. Companies like Atwater Kent and Zenith had spent years cultivating reputations for aristocratic quality, building radios that resembled heavy, opulent pieces of Victorian furniture. Philco had none of this pedigree. They were the gritty outsiders from the battery yards, but they possessed one crucial secret weapon. They understood the gospel of Detroit. Having spent years supplying electrical components to the booming automotive sector, Philco's engineers had internalized the revolutionary manufacturing philosophies of Henry Ford. They understood standardization, time-motion efficiency, and the relentless rhythmic flow of the assembly line. While their aristocratic competitors relied on skilled artisans slowly assembling radios one by one, Philco treated this delicate new technology with ruthless industrial pragmatism. They broke down the complex circuitry of a radio into dozens of simple, repetitive tasks. A worker on the Philco line didn't need to understand how a vacuum tube amplified an audio signal. They only needed to know how to solder 3 specific wires in exactly 4 seconds before the belt moved the chassis to the next station. This hyper-efficient system drastically slashed production times and, more importantly, plummeted manufacturing costs. In 1928, Philco released its first line of electric radios. They were not technological marvels, nor were they the most beautiful sets on the market, but they were reliable, loud, and priced aggressively below the competition. The strategy worked. The factory floor, which had nearly gone permanently dark just months prior, was suddenly deafening with the roar of mechanical belts and the hiss of thousands of soldering irons. By 1929, Philco had clawed its way to becoming the 3rd largest radio manufacturer in the United States, producing over 400,000 units in a single year. It was a miraculous resurrection. However, to truly conquer the living rooms of America and dethrone RCA, mere efficiency would not be enough. They needed a masterpiece. They needed an icon that would define the era. That icon arrived in the summer of 1930, precisely as the grim reality of the Great Depression was settling over the American landscape. With unemployment soaring and breadlines forming in every major city, the public's appetite for expensive cabinet-style luxury radios vanished overnight. People were terrified, isolated, and broke. Yet in their despair, they hungered for a voice in the dark, a connection to the outside world, a cheap form of escapism. Philco engineers and designers answered this cultural plea with the Model 20, affectionately known as the Baby Grand. The Model 20 was a radical departure from everything that had come before. Instead of a massive console that dominated half a parlor, the Baby Grand was a compact tabletop unit. Its cabinet was gracefully carved from bent wood, peaking in a rounded, symmetrical arch that struck a deep, subconscious chord. It looked exactly like the stained glass window of a Gothic cathedral. This cathedral design was an immediate, overwhelming triumph. It brought a sense of dignity and architectural grace into modest homes. Without demanding the floor space or the exorbitant budget of an RCA console. Priced at a remarkably low $49.50, less than half the cost of standard competing models, the Cathedral radio democratized the airwaves. It was an irresistible proposition. To ensure no American could ignore it, Philco unleashed a marketing blitz of unprecedented scale. They poured millions of dollars into advertising, buying full-page spreads in national magazines and sponsoring wildly popular radio programs. They built the largest network of independent dealers in the country, ensuring that wherever a customer lived, a Philco Cathedral was sitting in a storefront window nearby. The numbers were staggering. The Philadelphia factory lines ran in exhausting, around-the-clock shifts. In 1930 alone, despite the crushing economic depression, Philco sold hundreds of thousands of Cathedral radios. By 1934, they were moving over 1.2 million units annually. The scrappy battery maker had done the impossible. They had toppled RCA. Philco was officially the undisputed #1 radio manufacturer in the world. They were an empire, printing money and dictating the future of consumer electronics. But beneath the gleaming veneer of this spectacular victory, a dangerous new dynamic was taking root. The very strategy that had saved Philco, low margins driven by astronomical Ford-style volume, was a trap. They had built an industrial leviathan, a massive, hungry machine comprising dozens of factories and tens of thousands of workers. To survive on such razor-thin profit margins, the assembly lines could never slow down. The machine required constant feeding. It demanded an endless, escalating supply of new consumers, new products, and new markets to conquer. The executives at the top of the cathedral looked out over their vast, thundering empire, unaware that their triumphant machine had just traded the threat of sudden bankruptcy for a much slower, more insidious kind of peril, the absolute terror of ever standing still. By the late 1930s, the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company had firmly shed its gritty industrial origins. It was no longer a company fighting for survival. It was an undisputed corporate sovereign. Philco commanded a staggering 30% of the entire American radio market. To put that into perspective, nearly 1 out of every 3 radios purchased in the United States during the late Depression era carried the Philco badge. The company was producing over 2 million units annually, a mind-bending volume that left older, more established rivals like RCA and Zenith gasping for air. Their factories in Philadelphia were marvels of modern engineering, operating with a ruthless, synchronized efficiency that rivaled the automotive plants of Detroit. The massive assembly lines devoured raw timber, miles of copper wire, and thousands of glass vacuum tubes, spitting out finished, polished radios at a relentless pace. The wealth generated by this volume was immense. The company poured millions into research and development, constantly refining acoustic technology, introducing wireless remote controls, and even dabbling in the earliest, experimental stages of television broadcasting. Philco had reached the absolute golden peak of the consumer electronics mountain. They were a household name, synonymous with modern American life, evening entertainment, and technological progress. But the world outside the glowing dial of the living room radio was rapidly darkening. As the 1930s drew to a close, the drumbeats of war echoed across Europe and Asia. The United States government, quietly anticipating the inevitable, began surveying its industrial landscape, identifying companies with the manufacturing capacity and engineering talent necessary to equip a modern military. Philco, with its vast, hyper-efficient assembly lines and deep expertise in radio frequency and vacuum tube technology, was placed near the very top of the War Department's list. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the American consumer economy violently ground to a halt. Within weeks, the government issued strict orders banning the production of civilian radios. The materials required, copper, rubber, steel, and glass, were now critical to national security. For Philco, the transition was instantaneous and absolute. The beautiful walnut cabinets of the Cathedral radios and the sleek modern consoles were abruptly abandoned. The conveyor belts that had spent the last decade churning out domestic entertainment were abruptly stripped down, reinforced, and recalibrated for a much darker purpose. The executives in Philadelphia were no longer answering to the whims of the American consumer. Their sole client was now the United States military. The company was ordered to pivot its massive engineering apparatus away from commercial acoustics and toward the bleeding edge of military technology. They were stepping into a high-stakes arena where the quality of their products would be measured not in sales figures or consumer satisfaction, but in human lives and strategic victories. The transformation of the Philco factories was staggering in its scale and speed. The assembly lines were rapidly retooled to manufacture millions of complex artillery fuses, specialized communication equipment for infantry units, and ruggedized vacuum tubes capable of surviving the violent vibrations of heavy bombers. But Philco's most significant and secretive contribution to the Allied war effort was in the rapidly advancing field of radar. Before the war, radar was a bulky, experimental technology confined to massive ships and coastal installations. The military desperately needed miniaturized, reliable airborne radar systems that could be installed in fighter planes and bombers to hunt enemy submarines and navigate through zero-visibility conditions. Philco's engineers, heavily experienced in compacting complex circuitry into small tabletop cabinets, were perfectly suited for the task. They became one of the primary manufacturers of airborne radar systems for the Allied forces, producing tens of thousands of highly classified units that played a critical role in turning the tide of the naval war in the Atlantic and the strategic bombing campaigns in Europe. To meet these insatiable government demands, the company underwent an explosive, almost terrifying expansion. The workforce swelled to unprecedented numbers, pulling in tens of thousands of men and women from across Pennsylvania to man the round-the-clock shifts. The factory floors were a sea of localized intensity, where thousands of hands soldered classified circuits under the watchful eyes of military inspectors. The money flowed like a river. Government contracts guaranteed enormous revenues, shielding the company entirely from the unpredictable forces of the free market. Philco had morphed into a vital organ of the American war machine. They felt invincible, riding the crest of an artificial, government-funded economy. Then came the late summer of 1945. The Axis powers surrendered. The greatest global conflict in human history was finally over. The nation celebrated in the streets, but inside the boardrooms of America's industrial giants, a sudden, chilling reality set in. Almost overnight, the massive, lucrative military contracts that had fueled Philco's explosive growth evaporated. The War Department abruptly canceled orders for millions of dollars worth of radar equipment and munitions. The factories that had been running at an intense, feverish pace for 4 straight years suddenly faced a deafening silence. The executives at Philco looked at their empire and realized they were trapped in a dangerous paradox. They had won the war, but they had bloated their company to an unsustainable size. They had tens of thousands of employees on the payroll, massive, newly expanded manufacturing facilities, and a production capacity far exceeding anything the pre-war market could have absorbed. The war had inflated the Philco machine to a colossal scale, and that machine now required an astronomical amount of cash just to keep the lights on. They could no longer rely on the blank checks of the government. They had to return to the savage, unpredictable arena of the consumer market, and they had to do it immediately. They needed to find something, anything, to manufacture and sell at a volume massive enough to feed the giant they had created. The golden peak had passed, leaving behind an overwhelming pressure that would soon force the company into a series of desperate, chaotic gambles. The ink on the surrender documents had barely dried before the executives in Philadelphia realized they were in a terrifying race against their own infrastructure. The massive wartime machine they had built was a ravenous beast, and with government contracts vanishing overnight, it was starving. Returning to the pre-war status quo was impossible. Philco had hired too many people, built too many facilities, and expanded too far to survive on the margins of tabletop radios alone. They needed a new, revolutionary product, something expensive, complex, and desirable enough to keep their vast assembly lines moving. They found their salvation in the glowing, flickering screen of the cathode ray tube. Commercial television had been a nascent, experimental concept before the war. But by 1946, it was the new American obsession. Millions of returning veterans and their families, flushed with post-war savings and eager for a modernized lifestyle, wanted a television set in their living rooms. Philco, leveraging its immense radio manufacturing capability and its nationwide network of tens of thousands of independent dealers, threw its entire corporate weight into this new frontier. The transition on the factory floor was grueling. Television sets were exponentially more complicated than acoustic radios. They required massive, heavy glass picture tubes, complex high-voltage circuitry, and precise synchronization components. The assembly lines were completely overhauled once again. The air in the Philadelphia plants grew thick with the smell of ozone, hot flux, and the sharp tang of specialized industrial solvents required to manufacture the delicate internal components of the CRT screens. Despite the steep engineering learning curve, the aggressive gamble paid off immediately. Philco's marketing department launched a relentless, nationwide campaign, pushing their television sets with the same ferocity that had once sold the Cathedral radios. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the strategy was a resounding success. Philco was moving hundreds of thousands of televisions, capturing a massive share of the booming market and establishing itself as a premier brand in the new visual age. But this victory was built on treacherous ground. The television market was a brutal, cash-intensive battleground. RCA, holding a tight grip on crucial television broadcasting and manufacturing patents, forced competitors like Philco to pay steep licensing fees for every unit they produced. Furthermore, the technology was evolving at a breakneck pace. To stay relevant, Philco had to pour astronomical sums of money into continuous research and development. The profit margins on televisions, while seemingly high, were constantly being eaten alive by the sheer cost of keeping up with the technological arms race. The giant was feeding, but it was still hungry. To sustain their colossal size, the executives in Philadelphia concluded that dominating the living room was no longer enough. They had to conquer the entire house. This philosophy birthed a fateful corporate strategy: aggressive diversification into white goods, major household appliances. The logic in the boardroom seemed bulletproof. Philco already possessed the greatest distribution and dealer network in the United States. If a family trusted Philco for their radio and their television, why wouldn't they buy a Philco refrigerator, a Philco freezer, or a Philco window air conditioner? The company began expanding its appliance divisions, acquiring smaller manufacturers and retrofitting its massive factories to handle heavy sheet metal, insulated doors, and chemical refrigerants. It was a catastrophic miscalculation of identity. On the surface, the company was growing, boasting a sprawling catalog of consumer products. But beneath the corporate bravado, the foundation was fracturing. Philco was fundamentally an electronics company, staffed by men who understood acoustic resonance, radio frequencies, and vacuum tubes. Suddenly, these same executives and engineers were forced into brutal, unfamiliar wars over compressor efficiency, freon leaks, and the optimal layout of freezer shelving. This divergence created a devastating internal conflict. Every dollar poured into the marketing and development of a new refrigerator was a dollar siphoned away from their core electronics research. The company's capital, once sharply focused like a laser on acoustic and broadcast innovation, was now scattered like a shotgun blast across a dozen unrelated industries. Furthermore, they were no longer just fighting their traditional rivals like RCA and Zenith. They had boldly wandered into the territory of heavy industrial titans like General Electric and Frigidaire, companies with decades of specialized experience in thermodynamics and home appliance manufacturing. The dealer network, Philco's greatest asset, also began to buckle under the strain. Independent radio shop owners were suddenly expected to stock, deliver, and service massive heavy kitchen appliances, a logistical nightmare they were entirely unequipped to handle. As the 1950s progressed, the cracks in the Philco empire became visible. They were producing a staggering volume of goods, but their focus was completely shattered. They had traded their identity as the undisputed pioneers of sound for the exhausting role of a generic, all-encompassing conglomerate. By stretching themselves so thin, they had unknowingly left their flank entirely exposed. While their executives were busy arguing over the profit margins of kitchen stoves and air conditioning units, a quiet, invisible revolution was brewing in a laboratory far away from Philadelphia. A technological earthquake that would render their massive heat-generating vacuum tubes instantly obsolete. While Philco's executives were locked in brutal boardroom battles over refrigerator margins and washing machine distribution logistics, a silent, profound revolution was reshaping the foundation of modern technology. The era of the vacuum tube, the glowing, heat-generating, fragile glass heart that had pumped life into Philco's vast empire, was coming to an abrupt end. At Bell Laboratories, scientists had successfully developed the transistor, a tiny, solid-state device that could amplify electrical signals without the need for glass, vacuum, or intense heat. It was smaller, infinitely more durable, and required a fraction of the power. To the credit of Philco's engineering division, they were not entirely blind to this monumental shift. In fact, beneath the crippling weight of the company's appliance ambitions, a dedicated team of Philco researchers achieved a breathtaking technological breakthrough. In 1953, they invented the surface barrier transistor. This was not just a minor improvement, it was a high-frequency marvel that vastly outperformed early competing designs. Philco's transistors were so advanced that they became critical components in early high-speed computers and military aerospace systems. The engineers had handed the corporate leadership a golden key to the future. However, a technological breakthrough is only as powerful as the corporate strategy that wields it. The executives at the top of the Philco hierarchy suffered from a fatal institutional blindness. They viewed the surface barrier transistor primarily through the lens of lucrative military and industrial contracts, treating it as a highly specialized component rather than the foundation of a consumer revolution. The company was suffering from a classic case of the innovator's dilemma. Philco had tens of millions of dollars heavily invested in massive glass-blowing facilities, tube manufacturing lines, and the production of heavy wooden cabinets. Their entire consumer electronics infrastructure was built around the physical requirements of vacuum tubes. Transitioning their consumer radios and televisions to solid-state technology would mean cannibalizing their own highly profitable tube division and rendering their sprawling factories virtually obsolete overnight. Paralyzed by the sheer scale of their existing investments, Philco hesitated. They kept their world-class transistors largely out of the consumer market, choosing instead to squeeze the last remaining drops of profit from their antiquated vacuum tube technology. It was a conservative, seemingly rational financial decision that would ultimately doom the company. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the free market ruthlessly exploits hesitation. While Philco delayed the consumer application of the transistor, a small, ambitious Japanese company known as Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo, soon to be rebranded globally as Sony, saw the future with terrifying clarity. They licensed basic transistor technology, rapidly refined it for mass production, and in the mid-1950s, unleashed the TR-55, and subsequent models onto the global market. These were not the heavy furniture-style radios that Philco had built its empire upon. They were tiny, battery-powered devices that could slip easily into a shirt pocket. They didn't need a wall socket, they didn't take up parlor space, and they appealed directly to a booming, mobile teenage demographic that wanted to listen to the new phenomenon of rock and roll away from the ears of their parents. The invasion of the Japanese transistor radio was swift and devastating. The American consumer market shifted almost overnight. Philco, caught entirely flat-footed, scrambled to respond. But as they desperately tried to pivot their consumer lines towards solid-state technology, they hit a catastrophic wall. The company had run completely out of cash. The massive financial drain of the white goods division had finally caught up with them. The fierce appliance wars against General Electric and Frigidaire had bled Philco's capital reserves dry. Every dollar that should have been used to retool the Philadelphia electronics factories to compete with Sony had already been squandered on marketing campaigns for air conditioners and electric ranges. The internal civil war between the electronics division and the appliance division had fractured the company's focus and drained its lifeblood. By 1959, the situation was no longer just a decline. It was a corporate freefall. The giant multi-story brick factories in Pennsylvania were suddenly ghost towns, deeply inefficient and entirely unsuited for the delicate, microscopic assembly required by solid-state electronics. Philco's market share plummeted as their heavy, tube-based radios gathered dust on showroom floors. The company was hemorrhaging millions of dollars every quarter. The undisputed king of radio, the giant that had outsmarted RCA and armed the Allied forces, had completely lost its crown. Stripped of their cash, outmaneuvered by foreign competition, and suffocated by their own bloat, the executives realized that Philco could no longer survive as an independent entity. They were staring at imminent bankruptcy. The only way to save the name, the patents, and the remaining jobs was to find a buyer. Someone with pockets deep enough to absorb their massive debts. The proud pioneer of American sound was about to put itself up for sale to the highest bidder. The dawn of the 1960s brought a cold, unforgiving reality to the executive suites in Philadelphia. Philco was no longer charting the future of American electronics. It was simply fighting to survive the fiscal quarter. The company was bleeding cash at a terminal velocity. The brutal appliance wars of the previous decade had drained their capital reserves, while their hesitation to embrace the transistor revolution had surrendered the consumer audio market to nimble, aggressive foreign competitors. The sprawling, multi-story brick factories that had once been the envy of the industrial world now felt like massive, inescapable financial anchors. By 1960, the company's stock was plummeting, and bankruptcy was no longer a vague threat. It was a mathematical certainty. The proud executives who had once dictated terms to the entire consumer electronics industry were reduced to traveling salesmen, quietly and desperately shopping their own empire to the highest bidder. They needed a savior with incredibly deep pockets, a corporate titan willing to absorb massive debts to acquire the Philco name. Surprisingly, the lifeline did not come from a rival electronics firm. It came from Detroit. The Ford Motor Company, riding high on the post-war automotive boom, was flush with cash and suffering from its own brand of corporate anxiety. Henry Ford II was eager to diversify the automaker's portfolio beyond four wheels and an engine. Specifically, Ford was looking to aggressively enter the lucrative, rapidly expanding worlds of defense contracting and the burgeoning space race. While Philco's consumer division was an absolute financial disaster, its aerospace, and government divisions were hidden gems. Philco engineers had developed highly advanced tracking systems, military communications arrays, and early computer architectures. To the executives in Dearborn, Michigan, Philco was an incredibly attractive target. By purchasing the struggling company, Ford could instantly acquire a top-tier aerospace division, secure highly classified government contracts, and as a bonus, gain the internal capacity to manufacture millions of car radios for their own vehicles without relying on outside suppliers. The consumer electronics and white goods divisions, the very soul of Philco, were viewed by Ford largely as an inconvenient afterthought. In the late summer of 1961, the deal was finalized. Ford Motor Company purchased Philco for roughly $100 million in stock. The immediate threat of bankruptcy was neutralized. The factories would stay open, and the payroll would be met. But as the ink dried on the acquisition papers, a profound and tragic shift occurred. The Philadelphia Storage Battery Company, the scrappy survivor that had conquered the living rooms of America, officially ceased to exist as an independent entity. They were now a wholly owned subsidiary. The pioneers of sound had become just another line item on an automaker's balance sheet. If the financial acquisition of Philco was swift, the cultural integration was a prolonged, agonizing train wreck. The marriage between a Detroit automaker and a Philadelphia electronics firm was fundamentally incompatible. It was a collision of two entirely different industrial philosophies, and the friction was immediate. Within weeks of the takeover, teams of Ford executives and efficiency experts descended upon the Philco headquarters. These were carmen, managers who understood the world through the lens of heavy steel, predictable mechanical stamping cycles, and rigid, top-down bureaucratic control. They expected long product development cycles and massive, unyielding economies of scale. They were entirely unequipped to understand the volatile, almost ethereal nature of the consumer electronics industry. Electronics moved at the speed of light. Innovation in solid-state circuitry required agility, massive upfront investments in pure research, and the willingness to completely scrap a product line if a competitor introduced a better transistor overnight. When the Detroit executives looked at Philco's operations, they didn't see an agile technology company. They saw manufacturing inefficiency. Ford immediately began applying automotive cost-cutting measures to the production of delicate electronics. They instituted massive layoffs in the Philadelphia offices, replacing veteran radio men with automotive accountants. They demanded standardization of parts across completely unrelated devices, prioritizing cheap, predictable manufacturing over acoustic quality or technological advancement. For the Philco engineers, who had spent their lives pushing the boundaries of acoustics and broadcasting, the Ford regime felt like a suffocating occupation. Their budgets for consumer research and development were ruthlessly slashed. Proposals for new, innovative consumer products were bogged down in endless layers of Detroit bureaucracy, requiring approvals from men who didn't understand the difference between a vacuum tube and a semiconductor. The proud Philco brand name was systematically hollowed out. Under Ford's directive, the focus shifted sharply away from building the best possible consumer product. Instead, the priority became building the cheapest possible product that could still technically carry the Philco badge. The quality of their televisions and home stereos began a steep, noticeable decline. Consumers, who had once associated the name with the majestic Cathedral radios and wartime reliability, began to realize that the new machines felt flimsy, generic, and uninspired. The marriage had saved Philco from a sudden, violent death, but it had sentenced the company to a much slower, more humiliating demise. They were no longer masters of their own destiny. As the 1960s progressed, the Consumer Electronics Division, once the crown jewel of the American living room, was systematically starved of innovation, forced to march to the rigid, mechanical heartbeat of an automotive giant that cared only about its aerospace contracts and its bottom line. As the 1960s progressed, the corporate entity now officially known as Philco Ford developed a severe and tragic split personality. For a few brief, shining years, It appeared that Ford's acquisition might actually push the Philco name to heights even the original Philadelphia founders could never have imagined. But this success did not happen on the factory floors of Pennsylvania. It happened in the sterile, high-security laboratories of the military-industrial complex and the American space program. Ford Motor Company poured vast amounts of capital into Philco's aerospace and defense divisions, recognizing immediately that these were the true prizes of the 1961 buyout. The brilliant engineers who had once designed radar systems for World War II bombers were now tasked with charting the frontiers of the Cold War and the space race. They built advanced military communication satellites, sophisticated tracking stations, and early supercomputers. Their crowning achievement, and perhaps the greatest technological triumph ever to bear the Philco name, was realized in Houston, Texas. NASA contracted Philco Ford to design, build, and equip the legendary Mission Control Center at the Manned Spacecraft Center. When the world held its breath in July 1969 as Apollo 11 descended toward the lunar surface, the vital telemetry data, the life support metrics, and the voices of the astronauts were all being processed and displayed on custom-built Philco Ford computer consoles. They had literally helped guide humanity to the moon. It was an astonishing pinnacle of engineering prowess, a testament to the sheer brilliance that still existed within the company's ranks. But there was a dark, heartbreaking irony to this cosmic triumph. While engineers bearing the Philco badge were orchestrating the greatest voyage in human history, the original heart and soul of the company, the Consumer Electronics Division in Philadelphia, was being left to rot. To the automotive executives in Detroit, the men who had just conquered the moon, the business of building televisions and radios was an archaic nuisance. They viewed the sprawling, multi-story brick factories in Pennsylvania not as a proud industrial legacy, but as a massive liability. The consumer division was systematically starved of the vital research and development capital it desperately needed to survive the incoming technological storm. The brilliant minds that could have been designing the next generation of home entertainment were instead reassigned to defense contracts, leaving the consumer division adrift, leaderless, and dangerously exposed. The exposure was fatal. The American consumer market of the late 1960s and early 1970s was an unforgiving battleground. The transistor revolution, which Philco had once pioneered but failed to capitalize on, had fully matured. Foreign competitors, led by aggressive Japanese firms like Sony, Panasonic, and Toshiba, were no longer just making cheap novelty radios. They were flooding the United States with highly advanced, incredibly reliable solid-state color televisions and high-fidelity stereo systems. Against this onslaught of sleek modern imports, the Philco consumer division had nothing left to offer. Handicapped by Ford's relentless cost-cutting mandates, the Philadelphia factories were churning out outdated, heavy equipment that relied on obsolete designs. To save pennies on the assembly line, the automotive managers forced the use of cheaper components, resulting in a disastrous drop in quality control. Philco televisions became notorious for breaking down. The beautiful, resonant acoustics that had defined the Cathedral of sound were replaced by tinny speakers housed in cheap plastic and particle board cabinets. The American public is fiercely loyal, but that loyalty has limits. Consumers quickly realized that the Philco name no longer stood for pioneering quality. It stood for corporate compromise. Sales plummeted. Market share evaporated. Inside the massive Philadelphia manufacturing complex, the atmosphere turned funereal. The thundering roar of the assembly lines, a sound that had defined the neighborhood for decades, began to stutter and fade. Management initiated wave after wave of brutal layoffs. Men and women who had spent their entire adult lives building radios and televisions, workers whose parents had built automotive batteries in the exact same buildings, were handed severance slips and escorted to the gates. Entire wings of the historic factories were powered down, their windows boarded up, leaving vast, dark caverns of silent machinery gathering dust. Back in Dearborn, Michigan, the Ford Board of Directors looked at the balance sheets with clinical detachment. The aerospace division was a highly profitable point of pride, but the consumer electronics arm was a gaping financial wound, hemorrhaging millions of dollars every quarter and dragging down the parent company's stock value. Ford had tried to apply automotive logic to the delicate art of consumer electronics, and they had failed spectacularly. By 1973, Henry Ford II and his executive team reached a cold, inescapable conclusion. The original Philadelphia Storage Battery Company was completely dead. Only a decaying corporate tumor remained. The time for reorganization had passed. To save the profitable aerospace contracts, they had to sever the infected limb. Ford quietly began making calls, seeking a buyer who was willing to haul away the rusted scrap of America's former radio king. The calendar turned to 1974. A year marked by severe economic stagnation, a crippling global energy crisis, and a creeping sense of industrial vulnerability across the United States. Inside the towering, climate-controlled headquarters of the Ford Motor Company, miles away from the grime of the factory floors, the final verdict on the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company was quietly handed down. The grand, desperate experiment of merging automotive manufacturing philosophies with the volatile art of consumer electronics had proven to be a catastrophic failure. Ford's executive leadership had finally exhausted their patience with the hemorrhaging consumer division. They had successfully harvested the brilliant minds of the aerospace department and secured the highly lucrative, long-term government defense contracts that came with them. The rest of Philco, the television lines, the radio assembly, the white goods, and the massive manufacturing infrastructure that supported it all, was now officially deemed corporate dead weight. Ford did not simply shut the doors and walk away. They opted for a more clinical, drawn-out execution, a systematic liquidation. In the fall of 1974, the automaker announced that it was selling the entire Philco Consumer Electronics Division to the General Telephone and Electronics Corporation, widely known as GTE, the parent company of the rival Sylvania brand. For Ford, it was a necessary, pragmatic amputation to save their balance sheet. But for the workers back in Philadelphia, it was the sounding of the final, devastating bell. The transfer of ownership was not a corporate rescue mission. It was a salvage operation. GTE Sylvania had absolutely no interest in maintaining the vast, aging infrastructure of Philco's manufacturing empire in Pennsylvania. They were purchasing the established distribution network, a handful of useful patents, and the lingering, nostalgic goodwill still associated with the brand name. The physical factories themselves, the very beating heart of the enterprise, were slated for systematic dismantling. The scene that unfolded on the factory floors over the following months was one of profound, quiet devastation. For over 4 decades, these massive brick buildings had thrummed with a relentless, deafening rhythm. They had survived the Great Depression by churning out affordable tabletop sets, and they had armed Allied bombers during the darkest, most desperate days of World War II. Whole generations of families from the surrounding working-class neighborhoods had walked through those heavy iron gates, trading their sweat and highly specialized skills for a stable, middle-class life. Fathers had taught their sons how to wind delicate copper coils. Mothers had shown their daughters the intricate, precise art of soldering complex solid-state connections. Now those iron gates were padlocked shut. The mass layoffs did not happen all at once, but rather in agonizing, demoralizing waves. Thousands of highly skilled technicians, veteran assembly line workers, and floor managers were handed their final severance paychecks and ushered out into an unforgiving, economically depressed job market. Inside the cavernous production halls, the heavy machinery that had once stamped out the chassis of millions of televisions was unbolted from the concrete floors. It was auctioned off for pennies on the dollar, or hauled away in dump trucks as mere scrap metal. The miles of canvas conveyor belts were ripped down from the rafters. The distinct industrial scent of hot flux, heated glass, and ozone, which had permeated the air for half a century, slowly dissipated. It was replaced by the damp, cold smell of abandonment and standing water. Meanwhile, the Philco name embarked on a humiliating corporate afterlife. Under GTE's ownership, the brand was entirely stripped of its engineering independence and its pioneering spirit. There were no more brilliant research and development teams pushing the boundaries of acoustic resonance or battling to invent the next generation of transistors. Philco was reduced to a mere marketing tier within the larger Sylvania corporate structure. The Proud badges were simply slapped onto generic, budget-friendly electronics, many of which were increasingly manufactured in overseas facilities to exploit cheaper labor and cut production costs. The degradation of the brand was stark, undeniable, and deeply depressing to anyone who remembered its golden era. A consumer walking into an appliance store in the late 1970s might see a television bearing the classic Philco logo, but the machine inside contained absolutely no DNA from the pioneering company that had once dominated the American living room. It was a hollow shell, a ghost of a bygone era, leveraged solely to capture the dollars of older consumers who still subconsciously associated the name with the rugged reliability of the past. This slow, undignified fading continued into the next decade. By 1981, GTE had grown weary of the fiercely competitive, rapidly globalizing consumer electronics market and decided to exit the television and radio business altogether. They bundled the meager remains of Philco, along with their own struggling Sylvania division, and sold them off to the massive Dutch electronics conglomerate Philips. For Philips, acquiring the Philco name in the United States was primarily a strategic legal maneuver to secure trademark rights and eliminate a legacy competitor, not an earnest attempt to resurrect the fallen American giant. Under this new foreign ownership, the Philco brand was pushed even further into obscurity. It became a secondary label, relegated to the bottom shelves of discount stores, stamped onto converter boxes, cheap accessories, and entry-level imported electronics. The great industrial empire had not gone out in a blaze of glory. It had not been defeated in a single, honorable battle of technological innovation. Instead, it had been subjected to the most modern and ruthless of corporate deaths. It was carved up, its vital organs harvested, its loyal workforce discarded, and its proud name rented out until it meant absolutely nothing at all. The company that had once taught America how to listen was finally and irreversibly silenced. The sprawling multi-story brick complexes in Philadelphia that once housed the thundering heart of the Philco empire did not disappear overnight. Industrial behemoths of that scale rarely do. Instead, they suffered the slow, agonizing indignity of urban decay. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the massive buildings on Tioga Street and C Street stood as colossal, decaying tombstones to an era of American manufacturing that had permanently vanished. The miles of industrial windows, once glowing warmly with the light of round-the-clock wartime shifts, were systematically shattered by vandals and eventually boarded up with rotting plywood. The towering brick smokestacks that had once vented the intense heat of thousands of glass-blowing furnaces went completely cold, serving only as quiet perches for city pigeons. Inside the vast factory floors where tens of thousands of workers had intricately wired the legendary Cathedral radios and assembled classified World War II radar systems were entirely empty, surrendered to the elements. Rainwater pooled on the heavy cracked concrete, slowly rusting the few structural bolts and forgotten mounting brackets left behind by the brutal GTE liquidation. The silence in these cavernous spaces was profound. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, made all the more tragic when one remembered the deafening, organized symphony of mechanical canvas belts, hissing soldering irons, and proud human industry that had once defined this very air. Over time, the city of Philadelphia was forced to reckon with these rusting giants. Some sections of the historic Philco complex were ultimately demolished, the red bricks ground into dust by heavy machinery to make way for generic strip malls and modern sterile warehousing. Other buildings were gutted and repurposed, their rugged industrial souls paved over to create loft apartments or small-scale commercial spaces. The men and women who had built their lives, supported their families, and forged deep community bonds around those assembly lines aged, retired, and slowly faded away. As they passed, they took the living, breathing memory of Philco's golden era with them. Today, a casual observer walking past the remaining repurposed structures would have absolutely no idea that they were looking at the birthplace of modern American broadcasting, the epicenter of an empire that had once proudly produced 1 out of every 3 radios sold in the United States. But the physical decay of the factories is only half of the tragedy. The true cautionary tale of Philco lies in the spectral, undignified survival of its brand name. In the modern era, the once revered trademark has been endlessly bought, sold, and licensed by various international holding companies and conglomerates. You can still find the Philco badge today. It is printed on cheap disposable digital converter boxes, low-end DVD players, and budget window air conditioners sold in the fluorescent-lit aisles of massive big-box discount stores. These modern products are manufactured on the other side of the globe, designed by algorithms and built with the cheapest available plastics. They contain absolutely none of the engineering brilliance, the aesthetic pride, or the pioneering, risk-taking spirit that defined the original Philadelphia Storage Battery Company. This is perhaps the ultimate humiliation for an industrial pioneer. To have your name survive, but to have it completely hollowed out, stripped of all its original meaning, pedigree, and context. The Philco of today is merely a ghost in the static, an empty corporate sticker leveraged by foreign manufacturers to extract a few extra dollars from older consumers who still subconsciously associate the brand with the rugged reliability of their grandparents' living rooms. When we look back at the spectacular rise and devastating collapse of Philco, the lessons are as clear as they are unforgiving. It was not a single technological leap that killed the undisputed king of radio. The invention of the solid-state transistor and the subsequent influx of nimble foreign competition were merely the executioners. The true cause of death was entirely self-inflicted. Philco committed the ultimate corporate sin. They forgot who they were. They achieved unprecedented greatness by mastering the complex art of acoustic engineering and high-volume, highly focused manufacturing. They built an empire by being the absolute best in the world at one specific, incredibly difficult thing. But rather than defending that crown, rather than using their massive resources to lead the charge into the solid-state electronics revolution, they grew terrified of their own massive size. They chased the illusion of financial safety through mindless, aggressive diversification. They abandoned their core identity as the pioneers of sound to fight brutal, unwinnable wars over refrigerators, electric ranges, and air conditioners. In doing so, they starved their core innovators of vital research capital, fatally diluted their brand identity, and bled their vast treasury dry. The story of Philco stands as a monumental warning to any corporation that reaches the absolute summit of its industry. Growth for the mere sake of growth is a poison. When a company stops pursuing excellence in the specific products that made it great and instead treats its legacy merely as a financial engine to fund unrelated corporate conquests, the foundation will inevitably crack. Philco built the very machine that brought the world's voices into the American home. But in the end, surrounded by the deafening noise of their own expansion, They were completely unable to hear the sounds of their own demise. The story of Philco is a sobering reminder that in the unforgiving arena of global industry, a glorious past is no guarantee of a stable future. We often romanticize the great American factories as immovable titans, massive fortresses of brick and steel that could weather any economic storm. But a company is not its buildings, nor is it merely the sum of its balance sheets. A company is its focus. It is the absolute dedication to a specific craft, driven by a clear, unified vision. When the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company focused purely on building the world's most accessible, reliable, and beautifully resonant radios, they conquered the globe. The Cathedral radio remains a timeless artifact of industrial design, a physical testament to a time when Philco knew exactly who they were and exactly who they were serving. But the moment they traded that focused brilliance for the hollow pursuit of absolute conglomerate scale, the empire began to rot from the inside out. They spread their capital too thin, neglected their core technological advantages, and ultimately surrendered their autonomy to an automaker that neither understood nor respected their acoustic legacy. The ultimate tragedy of Philco isn't just that the thundering Philadelphia factories went silent. The profound tragedy is that the name survives as a captive ghost, stripped entirely of the engineering pride that once defined it. It stands as a stark lesson for the modern titans of industry. The moment you sacrifice the soul of your product on the altar of endless, mindless expansion, you have already written your own obituary. Did your family ever gather around a glowing Philco radio to listen to evening broadcasts, or perhaps own one of their later televisions or appliances? We would love to hear your personal memories in the comments below. The true history of American manufacturing is built on the lives and living rooms of the people who experienced it, and your stories help keep those echoes alive. If you appreciate these deep dives into the rise and fall of monumental industrial empires, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. We have many more stories of ambition, collapse, and legacy to uncover. Thank you for watching.